I open this hearing of the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport References Committee into the adequacy of Australia's biosecurity measures and response preparedness. Most of this evening's hearing will be conducted in person, but one witness, I should say, will be appearing via video conference. These are public proceedings being video streamed live via the Parliament's website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. This evening we will hear from a number of stakeholders involved in Australia's biosecurity response to the varroa mite incursion, including Plant Health Australia, which coordinates the emergency plant pest response deed. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. Witnesses also have a right to request to be heard in camera. I now welcome representatives from the Australian Honey Bee Industry Council. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Stephen Targett, Chair of Australian Honey Bee Industry Council.
Thank you.
Daniel Lefebvre, CEO of the Australian Honey Bee Industry Council.
Thank you. We have your submission, but you are also welcome to make a short opening statement if you like, and at the conclusion of any remarks I'll invite other members of the committee to make questions.
Thank you. Well, firstly I'd like to thank you for inviting us along today to provide our submission. The Australian Honey Bee Industry Council is the national representative body for the honeybee industry. We're a council structure and have 10 members from across the country, all the state associations, as well as members on the value chain, including honey packers and marketers, queen breeders, crop pollinators. So we have a broad base of representation. We, as the representative body in Australia for the honeybee industry, have been on the ground from day zero with the most recent varroa incursion. That incursion's been going for more than 70 days now. And so over that period of time that we've been in the control room in Orange, as well as representatives in Maitland, on the ground, we've had a lot of learnings, both positive and negative. What we've done is put together the submission number 65, that summarises some of those learnings we've had over that period of the last 70 days. Some of those are negative, but there's a lot of positives as well. And I can start with some of those positives that we've learnt over our last 3 months, nearly 3 months in the role. The commitment from the New South Wales Department of Primary Industry has been second to none. The staff on the ground there that have been dragged in from every part of the government, New South Wales government, into Orange, as well as into our forward control centres, has been outstanding. Their commitment and passion to driving forward the response that we've seen on the ground is blown us away. They've gone above and beyond their normal work and responsibilities. So I'd like to start by thanking the New South Wales government, and particularly the Department of Primary Industries, as well as all the other agencies that have been on the ground, including the RFS, Local Land Services, Fisheries, Forestries, National Parks, and amongst the other agencies that have been there from the first day. It's been incredible. So our submission, we've provided you with 8 recommendations, which is described there in some detail, but I can summarise those into 3 key areas. So 3 key areas that we want to get our message across to you guys is around funding. It's around the equitable funding of not only just the surveillance and preparation for an incursion, but also the equitable funding once an incursion happens, which is where we find ourselves now. It's about finding an equitable solution that is a true partnership between industry and government. We keep talking about in this response and incursions about how government needs to partner with industry, yet in preparation and in surveillance that's not occurring, particularly in the honeybee industry. We're relying on levies in the honeybee industry to pay for that surveillance. We're also relying on levies from our pollination-dependent industries, and granted some of those levies in the pollination industries are matched by government, but we're not seeing that true financial partnership from the majority of our government stakeholders. The other key area that we focus on is preparation. Now, it's preparation both in the industry as well as government. So for years we've been told as an industry that varroa incursion is not a case of if, but when it's going to happen. And we've known that. And as an industry, we've done a lot of training, a lot of simulations. We've been through a lot of preparations, designing response plans and getting agreement from industry. But now that it's happened, we're not as prepared as we thought we were. And I think that's a really key lesson for other industries to take away from this is we thought we were prepared, but we weren't. So some key things that we were lacking in preparation as an industry is having trained personnel on the ground. We don't have enough personnel in the industry trained to be industry liaison officers. Having that understanding of working within a government structure and in the hierarchy that we're operating in an incursion. We don't have enough personnel trained in media and being able to deal in a high pressure situation that we found ourselves in with Varroa and being constantly bombarded by the media looking for that story. We didn't have enough personnel on the ground trained to deal with that. We haven't had enough personnel trained in what a response looks like this. Whilst we've done plenty of scenario planning and training in this, we're finding that we haven't done that with the younger part of our industry. So whilst we've done training over the many years, a lot of those people have now moved on and out of the industry and we haven't focused on training our younger generation. The second thing I'd like to focus on, the part on the government's on preparation, with the government part of it. You know, again, we've done lots of scenario planning and simulations in partnership with government, yet we've arrived at this situation and there just was not the documentation prepared. There wasn't all the pre-designed orders on the ground. We've had response plans in place at a high level, but not with enough detail to really get things moving when we found this and hit the ground. So there could have been a much greater level. We didn't have enough equipment on the ground. So we were really slowed up at the start because we didn't have enough ethanol, enough alcohol to do alcohol washes. We didn't have enough Tyvek suits to be able to put PPE on people to be able to go out in the field and do this. We didn't have enough trained personnel in the departments. There hasn't been enough authorised officers available to work on the ground in this scenario. And it is a big response, but FMD is going to be much bigger. And the amounts that we rely on authorised officers to get the job done is incredible, and there's just not enough of them trained in the department. So we need a method of fast-tracking that authorisation and training. And the third point I want to touch on here is harmonisation, jurisdictional harmonisation. So this incursion has really highlighted, like we saw in COVID, the different rules that get put in place by different states. And there's no harmonisation and working across jurisdictions to provide one set of rules so that the industry can understand what's happening. Every state has different requirements, they have different goals, they're all doing their own risk assessments on the situation and putting in place different rules, which makes it really hard for the industry to be able to comply and abide by those rules and understand what's going on. So we would like to see much greater cooperation between those jurisdictions and a much more national approach to response. Even though this is only in New South Wales at the moment, we're seeing restrictions being put on multiple states and restrictions to trade of our industry through those differing restrictions in those states.
Wind it up.
Sorry?
Wind it up.
Yep. And so they're the 3 points that we want to raise and summarise from our submission. So thank you for having us.
Thank you very much, Mr Lefebvre. We might go to Senator Bush-Wilson first.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Perhaps as an example of restrictions or differences of approaches at a state level, are you, fipronil baiting, for example, are you aware of whether that's the EPA in New South Wales has approved a comprehensive program of fipronil baiting? Is that one example of?
Sure. So just from I can only speak of our experience as an industry liaison officer in the roles. Obviously, that's the responsibility, and the baiting program's the responsibility of the Department of Primary Industries. What I can say is I know that they have negotiated and liaised with all the different agencies involved. So National Parks, for example, is 17% of the red zone in Newcastle. Yeah. So are a large stakeholder in the response, and they've been highly engaged in that planning phase for that baiting program. EPA, again, I've been based in Orange for the last 70 days and they've been there nearly the whole time as well. So they've been highly engaged, not only with the baiting program, but looking at the euthanasia program of those hives as well. So there has been great cooperation between agencies and acceptance. And look, it's been a negotiation from the start. So our agreed plan at the start of this was to have a strong fipronil baiting program. What we've ended up with, because we've got such a large area now, is a blended approach between baiting as not a last resort, but baiting in the program, but a big emphasis on manual eradication of those feral bee colonies. So the plan is looking at engaging pest controllers to manually go to those feral bee colonies to eradicate as well.
Okay. You talked a little bit about the financial or funding aspects of the response. Is it Australia Honeybee Industry Council's view that either the federal or state government should be offering compensation for pollination services foregone throughout the response?
So we are
Or
signatories.
income from pollination services foregone?
Sure. So we are signatories to the Emergency Plant Pest Response Deed, for which PHA administer that for us. And as part of that deed, we have the owner reimbursement of cost program and framework in place. Now, that has provided some compensation for beekeepers, predominantly in those zones, but there is within that framework allowance for the potential of loss of income as a result of the response. Now, arguably, in industries like almonds, the loss of income that they've incurred hasn't been as a result of the response plan. That's been this cross-jurisdictional changing in regulations where they've put the borders up to movements which wasn't in the plan. It was never in the agreed industry plan to do that either. So that impact that's happened to some of those industries isn't necessarily as a direct response or result of the response plan that would provide that compensation.
Okay, because I did ask the department on this issue recently, and they said it was fluid, like it was something that they were considering. I was just wondering whether it was put to me that if there was compensation for pollination services foregone, there'd be less risk of beekeepers, doing the wrong thing, I suppose, and still transferring hives for pollination services.
Sorry, just to be really clear, you're talking about loss of income for beekeepers not being able to service those pollinations, or you're talking about the loss of...
No, but beekeepers, not for croppers.
Yeah, sure. So in the ORC framework, it does exclude compensation for loss of pollination contracts,
correct.
but it does provide loss of income for honey production. So even though those beekeepers didn't go and provide pollination, they are provided with loss of income if they were making honey over that period. So they are compensated.
For the loss of their own honey, but in terms of the income they might have got for I suppose...
Sure.
Not leasing their bees out, but you know what I mean.
We've been a bit blessed that it's happening in a relatively good honey year. If this had been happening in a drought, those pollination services for a lot of those beekeepers would be 60% of their income. That covers a lot of bills when you're in a drought year. It's not going to be so dramatic this year because there's been lots of rain, and so there's likely to be get a good quality honey crop. So pollination will only be 20%, 25% or whatever of their income. It's not a huge part of their income.
Okay.
So we've been blessed in the timing, seasonal wise.
Yeah.
So,
I'd just also add to that, though, that the whole industry is hurting. This doesn't just affect the beekeepers in New South Wales. We've got beekeepers in my home state in South Australia that can't access queens for the whole season now because of this incursion. That's going to have significant impact on their businesses. So if we were to provide compensation for every business in this industry that had some financial loss, there's no way we could provide that cost-benefit analysis to warrant eradication. And so everyone's been impacted in some way or another out of this.
Okay. Could I ask you in your submission, you mentioned the Australian Honeybee Industry Council is of the view that this incursion may not have originated from a port and is subsequently blindsided by security surveillance measures. Have you any thoughts on where it may have originated from if it didn't originate from a port?
So as part of our industry, we provide funding through our levies, through our honey levies, for a national bee pest surveillance program. Now that program has central hives and catch boxes and utilises sweep netting as well across a lot of high-risk ports in the country. And that is designed to be our first detection system. And it's placed at those ports that we feel that are going to be high risk. Now Newcastle, whilst wasn't part of the National Bee Pest Surveillance Program per se, did have surveillance hives at that port which were funded through the New South Wales DPI. That was the first detection point that we found it in. through the routine surveillance they did. And that was on Wednesday, the 22nd of June, when we were notified. On the Friday and the Saturday following that, there was some quick surveillance done in the immediate area around that, and they very quickly discovered that there was hives about 9-10 kilometres away from that original detection that also had high levels of mites. Now, the mites in there were much higher than what we found at the port. And since we found those and doing more surveillance around that area, discovered there's a whole cluster of hives in this one area around that sort of area of Newcastle that have very high loadings. And so theorising and hypothesising around that is that we think that it would probably originated away from the port. How that happened, we don't know. There's multiple pathways there of high risk. There's a commercial airport, there's a RAF base, there's an industrial area that imports containers and equipment. We have no way of knowing at this stage how it got there, but it's indicating that it probably did not come in from the port. And we also know the Port of Newcastle is a bulk handling port, not necessarily a shipping container port, so it's also of lower risk as well.
Okay. Is there any possibility that there could have been material illegally imported, like Queens or other?
It's always a possibility. We have no evidence to suggest that at this stage, and we don't know how it got here at all.
Yeah, is there any record of that having happened, or anyone being busted for that previously? Within, perhaps not your industry council.
There was a beekeeper who was picked up by a detector dog who was trying to import a couple of queen bees illegally. He had them in his pen in his pocket, and hats off to the dog. The dog sat beside him, and when they did it all, they discovered the queens.
Okay.
So the detector dogs is the trained to pick up bees. That's one thing that does work very well.
Okay. And would that have been, that person would have been doing it to deliberately bring in their own kind of
Genetics,
material and genetics?
Yeah, that was quite a few years ago.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And it's not a commonplace.
But it's not a common thing?
No.
Not to the best of our knowledge.
No.
Okay. Yeah,
Can I
please.
jump in?
Yeah.
Were there any sentinel hives around that? Was it around the Williamton Town Airport where you think the incursion may have first been?
No, not around,
Right.
not around Williamstown Airport. So all our sentinel hives are around ports, seaports, where
Right.
we consider that to be the highest risk.
Is that, if you do indicate a lack of funding in your submission, if you had more funding, would some sentinel hives go near airports?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. You mentioned many beekeepers are not compliant with biosecurity record keeping. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And also you mentioned, are you considering the feasibility of an electronic traceability system for the movement of beehives, queen bees and package bees? Just where, is that underway already? How long would you be away from that? And is that the kind of thing that you'd now need support for?
Sure. So as an industry, we have a national code of practice in place that we've implemented a few years ago to try and bolster particularly the biosecurity of our industry and have better record keeping, as well as doing annual alcohol washes for exotic pests and disease checks throughout that, and keeping good records of that. Now, it has different levels of legislative power in different jurisdictions. In New South Wales, the whole code's been adopted into legislation. So it is a requirement for every beekeeper in New South Wales to keep appropriate biosecurity records in accordance with the code of practice. What we've discovered in this incursion is that a lot of these beekeepers were in fact not keeping those records as much as they should have been, and non-compliance with that code of practice. So that's been one issue, is for the tracing, understanding where those bees have been. And
It's a voluntary code of practice?
no, in New South Wales it's
New South
legislated.
Wales. Okay, sorry.
It's not legislated in every state.
Yeah.
It's parts of it are legislated in different states, but New South Wales have adopted it in its entirety.
Right.
So we've identified in the initial stages of this incursion that biosecurity records of those beekeepers was an issue. It made tracing very difficult. Had to use things like truck logbooks to try and figure out where the bees had been in the past. So that was one issue. The second issue we discovered is that whilst we know through our registration systems where the beekeepers themselves live and where their residence is, we have no idea in an incursion where the actual hives are. And if a beekeeper doesn't want to tell you where they are, we're not going to find out. So that was a big problem in identifying quickly in this incursion about what the risks were for this incursion, understanding where those hives were, how many hives we were dealing with in different zones, and trying to plan out and provide response plans in a hurry, and understanding what those costings were going to be like. So one idea that has been floated for many years, but perhaps might start getting better traction now, is having electronic tracing, similar to what they do in the livestock industry, to try and identify in scenarios like this, where we can quickly identify where the location of those hives are, so that we can get onto a response really quickly, unimpeded, and prevent the way that we've had to do it in this scenario, is go door to door looking for bees. The other issue we found in this is that there's a...
Okay.
So there's no compulsion for beekeepers to be, even in a biosecurity circumstance, to advise where their hives are?
So in this incursion, when the emergency zones were put in place, the 10 kilometre eradication zone, 25 kilometre surveillance zone, and then out to the 50 kilometre notification zone, all those zones had a legal requirement to notify of your hive location through the hotline. Now, that was reasonably successful and there was reasonable compliance with that, but there was still a significant amount of bees that weren't notified of where their locations were, and even now still finding hives that we didn't know about. Now, that's not just in the commercial sense, which is what we're talking about with tracking, but that was also in the recreational space, where we found significant numbers of hives unregistered that were unknown to the government in those zones, and that's also been a big problem, to the point where we're trying to plan a response plan and cost it. How do we do that if we don't know what's in the zone and how much manpower we're going to need to pull hives out of that?
Thank you, Senator Wishful. Thank you. I'm going to go to Senator Colbeck.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Just to follow on from that, and the testing protocols or the inspection protocols that existed in the various zones for the hives, and particularly when movement commenced in the areas outside the zones. And I think the department was talking to us about an inspection rate of about 1 in 10. But just through the reading that I've been doing and the interaction that beekeepers, whether they be recreational or commercial for that matter, would, or with good practice, should be having with their hives, I would have thought that the sector would be looking pretty closely at everything that they've got, particularly in the early stages while you're trying to work out what was happening and where, and particularly in the context of the obvious threat of varroa, which has been understood for a long time. I think I take your points in relation to the action that you've taken, and you weren't as prepared as you thought you were. I actually get that. I've seen that previously during COVID. But I'm just concerned it's at the what appears to be the rate of inspection across the sector in relation to the hives, given our clear understanding of the potential impact of this. I mean, I would have thought between, 22nd of June when this was discovered and now, everybody should have been looking in all of their hives anyway. They all should have had every hive in New South Wales, or should have had somebody sticking their nose into it, and while they were doing it, having a look to see if there was an impact.
Sure. So part of the order when this first happened was a standstill order applied across all of New South Wales, and part of that was a do not tamper order as well, so except for surveillance. So beekeepers were allowed to do surveillance in their own hives, even in the early stages, and and there's been significant amount of surveillance done by beekeepers on this.
And look, I know that there's beekeepers from all over the country coming into New South Wales to assist as well, so there's been a significant effort.
Absolutely, and even interstate, so Queensland, South Australia, Victoria have all been doing surveillance on their own hives. And so there was significant amount of surveillance done by beekeepers in New South Wales, but it was never captured or recorded because they were doing it themselves and there was no need or requirement or order that required them to report that washing to the department. So we don't actually know those numbers. We do know there was, just through industry reports to us, that there was a significant amount of people looking at their own hives, whether it be commercial beekeepers or recreational. It was no different. Everyone was looking. We also, as part of the Code of Practice, have a requirement to do testing for exotic pests once a year, and in New South Wales we have Sugar Shake Month, which is the month of May, April. Month of April. This year we had, I think it was about 70% increase in participants in that. That is reported to the department through Sugar Shake Month. So beekeepers have been looking really hard, and I think that's evidence that despite the beekeepers looking and not finding anything, the Department of Primary Industry has also done over 27,000 hives now in the surveillance zone, in what was the yellow zone, and also in the blue zone with the almond surveillance, and also not turned up any mites.
Yeah.
So there has been a significant amount of surveillance done across those areas by both the department and the beekeepers.
So in the red zones, where are we at with the destruction of the existing colonies? And my understanding was, or the evidence we've received so far was, that the first process was to destroy the existing colonies and then move through into looking at the wild colonies. Can you give us a sense of where you see us being in that?
Sure. So the first stage is identifying and delimiting where that mite is. And so there was a real big focus early on looking at how far that spread was, particularly in those purple and yellow zones. So a big focus in that area. So destruction of the hives, apart from the IPs, was put on hold in the early days to really get an understanding of whether this was going to be containable and eradicable, or whether it escaped and had been there for a long time. So there was a lot of surveillance done, and it just wasn't turning up in those purple zones. And so the focus has switched back to the red zones and pulling all those managed colonies out. Now, where we're at the moment is we're sitting at 99 infected premises, and that's been like that for several weeks. And it's been like that because they have stopped looking in the red zone for mites and focused on just eradicating the colonies in those zones. So they have pulled out nearly 3/4 now of all the managed colonies from the red zone in the Newcastle area, which is a phenomenal amount of hives. There's nearly 16,000 hives through that area. And they are at the point where they're going to be able to start baiting program and pulling out those feral colonies with that blended approach that I talked about before, and start really making sure that there is no more hosts left for the mite to stay in. And so that process, whilst being a huge job, it's been taking, on a daily basis, is well and truly over 250 personnel on the ground every day in this response. There's been nearly 1,600 different government department people work in the response at some point in time over the last 70 days. And so they've really had a huge effort in clearing those zones. And so at the moment the plan is to clear those zones around those initial IPs, infected premises, out to 6 to 10 kilometres, which is the red zone, and then progressively work the way back towards the coast, and clear it out that way and try and choke the mites out back towards the coast.
What's the situation been with domestic recreational hives? Are they and similar process and outcome?
In terms of euthanasing in the red zones?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's non-discriminatory. It's both commercial and recreational. We're all part of the same industry.
Yeah.
Still the same insect that we're managing, and so it's just as important. And it's been, a challenging process, and there's been a lot of hurt in those red zones. I acknowledge that a lot of people have lost some income and lost some of the insects or some of the colonies that they've been working for years to maintain and produce and develop and gain income from. And now that's
queen breeders and
queen breeders as well, but we've been fortunate enough to be able to negotiate a protocol that where there is important high value genetic material in people's hives, that we've been able to save that stock. Okay. So there is there's
been a protocol developed to do that?
Correct. There's a mechanism now that allows anyone in those red zones that have high value breeding stock that they can demonstrate that it is high value breeding stock, and that might be through evidence of sales of queens or evidence through their biosecurity records that they are breeding from those high value queens. To actually take them to an entomologist, have them put under a microscope and declared varroa free, and then bring those out of the zones.
So it's a
and-
physical inspection.
Correct. Physical inspection,
And removal
highly,
if necessary.
highly labour intensive,
Yeah.
but it is saving that high value genetic material.
One more question.
Yeah. I just wanted to go to your three key issues and particularly the one around surveillance at key entry points, if you like. We've received a response to a question that we put to the department at a previous hearing that lays out what is where in terms of surveillance hives, trap hives and settling boxes, if you like. It's a bit of a takeaway piece of work for you. I'd be interested to get your sense of that information and what it might look like, because I think that's one of the things that we can look at. You know, as you said, it wasn't the initial place of infection because it's not going to turn up in an existing colony unless it's been brought in by a single drone, but it seems as though it's more like a hive that's come in and moved and found somewhere to settle and then spread out from there. So looking at how we start resolving and better providing the response that you talked about in your submission and your early comments, I'll be interested to get a sense of what your thoughts are in relation to the balance of the different elements of that early detection, because that's the thing that's going to occur. There's no zero risk, but how we best, with the experience of what we've seen here, modify where we're at to look to, well, let's hope we can eradicate and then go from there with maintaining a free, varroa-free circumstance.
Yeah, I think we have looked and done risk assessments of different points of entry in the past, and I don't think we would have identified this at any point as being a high-risk entry point, assuming it was found away from the port like I described earlier. If we had infinite amount of funding, we would provide surveillance at all our ports around the country, as well as airports and other, RAF bases, for example, where we consider that to be a reasonable risk, but not necessarily a high risk. And so this really comes back down to funding. As an industry, we contribute a significant amount. We're only a small industry, despite how big an impact we do have on agriculture. In terms of a dollar value, we are only small and can only generate a limited amount of money towards surveillance. And given that there's increasing costs in doing the surveillance, we did do a review. PHA facilitated a review of all the ports in Australia and recategorised based on risk what ports we would focus on. Now, Newcastle dropped off of that list as a high-risk port because it's not a container port, it's a bulk handling port. And given that the majority of our incursions have been in places like Queensland, that's where our focus has been in there. So it really does come back to the dollar and having enough money to be able to provide enough boots on the ground to do the surveillance right across the country at all the high-risk ports. And that is an argument whether that cost should just be borne by the industry. You know, the people bringing in these containers and importing these products are the ones profiting from that activity, yet they're the ones creating the risk. We know that the highest risk for importation is on shipping containers and on equipment that's coming into the country, yet it's industries that have to fund that surveillance to find those incursions. It's also industry that has to fund, in partnership with government, fund the response as well. Yet the people that are profiting from bringing in this equipment and bringing in these products that are potentially bringing those risks are not contributing to either the incursion or the surveillance.
And that's exactly the same for other industries, like the marmorated stink bug and things like that. That's exactly the same. They're coming in on imported containers and affecting rural industries, and it's all the rural industries that are paying for it. It's the cost shifting is going from the city people who get most of the imported products to the rural people who have to fund the response. So it's not just the bee industry.
Do you think the risk rating is right?
Sorry?
You said Newcastle's dropped off. Do you think the risk rating is right that allows Newcastle to drop off? Or is it a risk rating combined with capacity, money?
Well, it's definitely hamstrung by money. It is, without a doubt. Now, is that risk rating right out of that report? You know, there's smarter people than me that have prepared that report that understand those risks assessments better than I do. So I can't really provide a comment on how accurate it is. I can only judge it by what's provided to us.
Thank you. I'll just remind senators we do have 3 other witnesses this evening. Happy to go a little bit over in this session, but we obviously want to get to everybody too. Senator White.
Thanks for that. We've just touched on that biosecurity levy on container imports. What are your views about how we could, how that levy could be implemented?
So we have looked at this in the past. There was a bill, and PHA might be able to help me out, several years ago that was proposed to look at levying shipping containers to provide funding for surveillance programs. And it's not just the honeybee industry, for all industry, primary industries. So I think given that shipping containers are one of the highest risks for importing of pests into our country, that it should be a levy across all containers, regardless of what products they're carrying or where they've come from, to provide some equitable funding for surveillance programs.
So you just blanket across the board, you think, all containers?
I think it's the only fair way. Our honey is levied blanket across the board, so it doesn't matter who you are or where you are in the country. If you're selling honey, you're paying levy towards the program as well.
Okay, so obviously been calling for a range of things over a long period of time, and you've done a lot of work. Are there any measures that you've been calling for prior to the detection on the 22nd of June to better address the risk of varroa mite to the bee industry? So you've touched on the biosecurity level. What else have you been calling on people to do?
So biosecurity, the equitable funding, you know, we have been asking for assistance in the surveillance program. Like I said, that surveillance program is predominantly funded by industries, whether it be the honeybee industry or the pollination-dependent industries. Now, the mechanism we're using at the moment through Hort Innovations and the levied industries within Hort Innovation is matched because it is levy money through the Commonwealth, so there is some funding there from government, but we're largely left on our own devices to provide that surveillance program. And we're going to be in real strife. That surveillance program, luckily, was just re-signed for another 3-year deal in November or December of last year. And it was an incredibly hard job for Hort Innovations to convince their levied industries to contribute to the surveillance program. And I think, you know, these sort of things, whilst you're in peacetime, you're not in an incursion situation, it's very hard to convince growers to be able to put money into these type of activities, whilst it's not affecting their bottom line. And so I think we're in real danger after this next round of 3-year funding of really struggling to find enough funding to do this again.
So you also touched on, you know, that you think that there should be barcodes on the you know, the maintaining of records. On that theme, what else do you think? So broadly, so not just biosecurity, what other things do you think should be done in the industry to assist?
So we know all the state departments in the RB sector are understaffed. We don't have enough compliance officers. So one of the reasons a lot of our beekeepers in this scenario have not been keeping records, and I shouldn't say that's blanket, there are a number of beekeepers that are in quality assurance programs that are maintaining good third-party audited records regularly, and it's not everyone in the industry, but there are a number that aren't. And there's no compliance, there's no big stick to follow up and make sure that people are complying with the legislation. And that's not just in New South Wales. Every state department has been peeling back on-ground people, and we know that across all the industries. And so that is one thing that would provide better assistance to our industry in providing more compliance and biosecurity officers on the ground for us.
And I guess also compliance, as you say, for the amateur beekeeper as well. They should be complying too, shouldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And they still should be complying with our code of practice because it is legislated and we are one industry. We have a lot of work to do in our recreational sector. It's a sector that's exponentially grown over the last 4 or 5 years, and we haven't grown as an industry with that sector, that part of our industry, and it is certainly something that we have been lacking in and should be doing a better job of.
So can I ask you then, so you've talked about state and territory responsibilities, but can you sort of elaborate on what you think the breakdown between state and territory government responsibilities and the federal government managing the threat should be? How they should work? Who's responsible for what?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure what the actual split should be. I just don't think it should be, well, we don't think it should be completely reliant on industries who aren't creating the risk here to providing all the income, all the funding to provide surveillance. And then also have to come along and pay, in this scenario with Varroamide, a 50-50 cost share with industry and government. So we're not only paying through our honey levies for the surveillance, we're also then having to pay through our honey levies for the response. And in our industry, we're also using our honey levies to fund our own biosecurity officers in each state that are embedded in the department, because the departments don't provide us enough boots on ground to achieve what we need to achieve.
To be fair, there, New South Wales DPI are funding a biosecurity officer whose primary role is looking after the recreational beekeeping side of the house. Because as Danny said, the recreational side has grown exponentially in the last half a dozen years, but that hasn't extrapolated to extra money for surveillance or anything like that, because they don't sell enough honey. There's a $1,500, where below that it costs more to collect the honey, the levy, than what you collect from the levy. So the recreational people, while they're important for biosecurity, because often they find it sometimes before the commercial people, they're not contributing to biosecurity from that point of view.
And just one further point, because I feel we're going to be cut off soon, to add to that is, at the moment we can only provide levies on honey because it's a product. A large and growing proportion of our industry is pollination services. And when we're on pollination services, we're not producing honey. And so as a nation, we're seeing a sliding national crop of honey over time, yet the costs of doing everything we do keep increasing. So through the legislation of the levy collection, we're not allowed to levy our pollination services. So we've got a huge part of our industry that's not contributing to this as well, who arguably are very much affected as well. So there's a little bit of imbalance even within our own industry.
Yeah, so you think it's skewed to one part of the industry and everybody's got a responsibility to be involved. Would that be a fair way of summarising what you just said?
Yes.
Yeah, and one other question. Can I just ask you, how did you first learn of the detection of Varroamide in New South Wales?
From my chair.
I got a phone, sitting in an airport, got a phone call from DPI, and they said we have seen Varroamide. It's in New South Wales. It's in Newcastle.
And was that on the 22nd of June?
Yes. Yep.
Thank you, Senator White. Just got a quick one, and Senator Colbeck has a couple of others. Just on the funding issue, I just wanted to clarify. I believe Planet Health Australia has suggested the levy extend to pollination services in their submission. I just want to clarify, you support that, do you? But you also think there should be a levy on containers as well to provide sufficient funding?
Yeah, look, like I said, we've got a proportion of our industry that's not contributing to this. And very few beekeepers are solely pollination providers. Majority, probably 90% of beekeepers do produce honey as well, so it's not like they're not contributing at all. But whilst they're on pollination and not making honey, and there's an opportunity that we're losing there to collect more levy, and we've been arguing for a long time now that we do need to provide levies on pollination services, and we've been pushed back from the Federal Department of Ag on that, saying that it can't be done because it's a service, not a product.
Right. Okay. And that would, under your plan or proposal, it would raise more revenue. It wouldn't just reallocate the amount raised across the entire industry. The idea would be to raise more.
It would raise significantly more.
Okay.
Can I just ask as a matter of interest on that, Chair? Would it be likely that the beekeepers would pass on the cost of that levy in terms of a higher charge to agricultural producers?
Likely.
Likely.
But given the rate of the levy might only be 1% or 2%. So it's not going to be a huge.
It's already happening with honey, obviously.
Correct.
Yeah.
And do you have any figures on how much raised now and how much it would raise if you extended it to pollination? Is there a broad estimates of that?
No, because we've never gone down that path,
Okay.
because we haven't even been given the green light to look at it. We've been told it can't be done.
Okay. Senator Colbeck.
So I was going to ask a question about that too. So that's under your levy raising agreement or for honeybees. Is that what's saying?
Yeah, it's
That's the advice that you've been given
from the federal.
You would raise your levy under an agreement probably through the Rural Industries Research Act, I would have thought.
It'd be a.
But you would have to
legislative-
change that, and there'd have to be agreement from the sector to change that.
Well, at the moment, through the levy system and the legislative process, we can't levy a service.
Okay.
And so it's prohibited by law, not necessarily just because we can't organise it.
No, okay, all right, that's something perhaps we can look at. Keep a note of that, of course, Jerry. Going back to the point that you made about, you know, you had a plan based on a significant bit of work in the lead up to the initial discovery of the incursion, and there were things that you are now doing that you didn't anticipate that you were doing, and I think movement was one of those things, although I have to say I would have thought that would have been one of the natural things to put into a management plan to start with while you worked out where it was and mitigate it. And clearly you've got the different state-based things, and welcome to Federation. But I would have thought there would have been a good piece of work that could have been done on the back of what we're dealing with now, to go back, review what you've had to do, what was in your plan and wasn't in your plan, and how it might look with the experience of the last 3 or 4 months, to update what your plan might look like in the circumstance of a future incursion which has a level of likelihood. So you would welcome a process or particularly some resources to be able to do that?
Without a doubt, and varroa mite's not our only threat. We've still got another 2 big threats on our border, Treponema mite and tracheal mite. And so even if we are unable to eradicate varroa mite, we still need to have a strong surveillance program, have strong plans in place, because we don't want the other pests that are out there. We know there's mite so far. We haven't been able to detect any viruses in with this mite.
Yep.
And it's the viruses that do the damage, not the mites. So we want to protect our industry from getting those viruses as well. So if we weren't able to eradicate this mite, we're certainly not laying down our swords. We've got a lot of work to do here, and yes, we'll debrief and review and reflect on the experiences we've had and try and bolster our responses and our plans as an industry to make sure that we are better prepared. But we'd also really welcome being able to work with the different jurisdictions to also make sure they're better prepared as well.
Yeah, okay.
My question was actually on that different jurisdictions. You mentioned that you thought it should be harmonised because there were differences, but do you think if it was detected in a different jurisdiction, it would have been managed differently? So let's pick one and tell me what if it could have been different.
Tasmania would have done a brilliant job.
I thought Victoria would have been superb.
Look, it's really, really hard to say.
Jurisdictions into the overall EADRA process, wouldn't you?
Yeah, so part of the deed process is that everyone who's a signatory to the deed and then who's actually an affected party in this contributes. So everyone reviews the response plans, agrees to it, and all parts of that. So everyone has an input to it. Is there a jurisdiction I would have preferred to have this in? Look, from being on the ground for the last 70-odd days in this response, I can't fault the commitment and the enthusiasm and dedication that the New South Wales Department have provided in this response. And I'm not about to speculate whether another state would have done a better job, because I think they've done a fantastic job with the tools they've been given and the resources they've been given.
So how do you, if it had appeared in multiple jurisdictions at one time, how do you think it would have gone?
I think we would have given up.
Yeah, we would have struggled, yeah.
I think we're at the limit in terms of the size of this detection. We are at the limit with the volume or area of red zone. We can't handle it being much bigger than what it is.
So just on that, then, what's the reaction been of the other jurisdictions, your members in the other jurisdictions, to this threat in, what's been happening in New South Wales? I think you said that it was all hands to the wheel. Has that continued to be, and how are they all feeling about it all?
Sure. There's been a good level of cooperation. So we have had personnel from interstate come and help on this response. But having said that, both Victoria and Queensland have both stood up their own incident management teams. So they've also committed a lot of their own resources, which is outside of the agreed response plan and not funded or cost shared across industries. So there is a depleting of the resources across the board. When I talk about the harmonisation of jurisdictions, we are seeing this protectionism coming into play. And it's very hard for those states because they have very differing views. The industry is divided around this, about whether we can deal with it if it was to be non-eradicable, or whether we should just be preventing the spread of it as much as possible. And there's a huge divide in opinion on that. So the government is in a difficult space in trying to make those decisions, but having put the restrictions they have in place is really impeding trade of our industry. And as an organisation, the peak representative body, we have agreed many years ago to what we call the 5-zone policy, which is to support eradication as much as possible, but also support business continuity and allow movement. Critical to business continuity in the bee industry is migration and movement of hives. And you restrict movement of hives, particularly across borders, like it is at the moment, you are impacting the trade of our industry. However, we don't want to encourage that movement if it's going to impact the feasibility and put at risk the eradication program, because that is our number one, is eradication.
Especially if you, as you said earlier, you don't have the information necessarily on that movement down pat yet.
Agreed. That's why the standstill order was put in place. And in New South Wales, they issued an electronic permit system. So every movement needs to be lodged on a permit system. So there is complete visibility on where those hives have come from and where they've gone to. And that permit system online has been critical to this response and understanding where those hives are.
Thank you, and thank you very much. Just quickly, I want to get on the record, eradication remains the achievable goal in your view.
100% in our view at the moment that it's very achievable, provided everyone supports the program and does the right thing, particularly from the industry participants.
Okay, well, let's hope that happens. Thank you very much for your evidence. It's been very useful for our committee's purposes. I don't believe any questions have been taken on notice, but...
Sorry, Chair, could I just ask one very quickly? Perhaps if you could take this on notice, but in terms of potential beekeepers who don't do the right thing, do you feel the fines at a state level, for example, are acceptable, or could they be a cost of doing business?
So at the moment, if a beekeeper moves hives without going through the permit process or illegally moves hives, the fine is $1.1 million.
Wow.
If it's unintended. If it's intentional, it's double plus jail time.
Okay.
So the fines are considerable. The question is are they going to be prosecuted and enacted? So the big stick's there. It's got to be used in some points.
Well, thank you very much. I don't believe you've taken any questions on notice, but if you have, please return those by Thursday, the 22nd of September. Thank you very much again. Have a good evening. And with that, I will welcome representatives from Plant Health Australia. I now welcome representatives from Plant Health Australia, and I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Sarah Corcoran, CEO of Plant Health Australia.
Thank you.
Susanna Dreesen, General Manager, Emergency Response, Plant Health Australia.
Thank you very much. And I invite you, if you wish, to make a short opening statement. Thank you for your submission. And at the conclusion of any statement, we'll go straight to questions.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here this afternoon. The organisation that we're representing here today is Plant Health Australia, and we've been operating for 22 years as the National Coordinator of Government Industry Partnerships for Plant Biosecurity. Our role is to facilitate those partnerships and improve policy and practice and performance of Australia's plant biosecurity system, and maintain it at an internationally outstanding system for the sustainability and profitability of Australia's agricultural industries. We are a not-for-profit public company limited by guarantee and funded by our members through annual subscriptions, and our members are all Australian governments and all of the major plant peak industry bodies, of which 39 are our members, along with 10 associate members. We are a levy recipient body in relation to 2 levies, the Plant Health Australia levy and the Emergency Plant Pest Response levy, with legislation in relation to both of those contained in the Plant Health Australia Plant Industries Funding Act. The PHA levy is used by a large and increasing number of plant industries to invest in activities that prepare and protect their industries, and it's negotiated at the grower levels for the support of those levies, and it comes from an understanding that they greatly assist producers by pooling their effort and resources to work together and find solutions. The Emergency Plant Pest Response Levy provides a mechanism for industries to fund preparedness and eradication activities to reduce the threat of exotic plant pests. We also deliver initiatives that strengthen the system and protect our plant industries as well as our unique natural environment, and these include Plant Plan, which is the first nationally consistent emergency response plan for emergency plant pests, the National Plant Biosecurity Strategy, which is underpinned by the Intergovernmental Agreement on Biosecurity. Now, this decadal plan is a significant contributor to seeing the National Biosecurity Strategy, recently released, being implemented, and the Emergency Plant Pest Response Deed, which is the legal agreement that sets out how incursions of emergency plant pests are responded to and cost-shared in Australia. We are the custodian of that deed, and it's signed by all Australian governments and a total of 38 industries. And it is the envy of many countries due to the benefits that it brings. In conclusion, the impacts of pests and diseases are estimated to contribute 20 to 40% of crop losses every year, and our goal is to see plant biosecurity not only enhance our ability to manage pests and diseases, prevent their establishment and spread, but also to provide Australia with food security now and into the future. We work across those areas of preparedness, surveillance, diagnostics, emergency responses, research and development, and we're well versed in bringing the expertise, knowledge and stakeholders together to generate plant biosecurity solutions. As our world is changing and the biosecurity threats become more complex, it is imperative that we invest collective effort into a common purpose with clear outputs, and that includes creating the shared biosecurity culture where we not only share the responsibility of biosecurity but also the benefits to all Australians. We have a long-standing relationship in terms of bee biosecurity through partnerships and the management and coordination of surveillance programs, response activities, exercises and training programs. And again, I'd like to thank yourself, Chair, and the committee for convening the inquiry, and look forward to answering your questions this evening.
Thank you very much, Ms Cochrane. I've just got a quick question first. Just leading on from where we ended the previous witness, the question about funding. I note in your submission you suggest that the levy should be extended to pollination services. Can we just clarify what are the roadblocks from that happening? We heard from the previous witness that in their view the department is saying that can't happen. Is that your interpretation, and what needs to happen to change that if this is a good idea?
So I understand that ARBIC explored whether or not this was an opportunity.
Could you just, who is ARBIC?
Sorry, the Australian Honeybee Industry Council,
right.
who just appeared before us.
Okay.
That they explored whether or not that was a possibility. And under the levy guidelines, a levy proposal must nominate a levy collection point in the supply chain. It also must define a leviable commodity, determine a unit or levy, determine the rate of the levy, and determine the levy frequency the levy return frequency. And in the case of pollination services, they're considered a service and they're not listed under these principles, unfortunately, which precludes them from establishing that levy.
I might be going beyond your knowledge, but are they guidelines or in legislation, or what would
That's
need
the
to...
levy guidelines in terms of how they're established. There's only one industry that has that ability, and that's racehorses for servicing.
But we wouldn't necessarily need to change laws to allow an expansion to services, or
No.
you don't have to say... No, we wouldn't have to do that. Okay, we'll obviously take that up with the department. And just briefly then on the broader suggestion of a levy applying to containers at ports. Do you have a view? Does Plant Health Australia have a view on that?
The investment to date, and as we've heard previously from our industry partners, comes from investment from growers, essentially, the levies that they pay into plant biosecurity. Ideally, we would like to see a funding model that brings in other beneficiaries when we do have incidents to emergency plant pests. And the container levy proposal was one measure that could have delivered that, but I understand the consultation around that levy was not as good as what it could have been, and hence there was the feeling of not being brought along on the journey when the discussions were had. That doesn't preclude us from thinking about doing something similar in the future, and in terms of that rolling out that process, then the recommendation would be a consultation, extensive consultation
From
process.
memory, there was the issue that some, like bulk importers or exporters, felt that they were not the risk factors and being asked to pay when perhaps general freight was the issue. Is that a fair recollection of the controversy?
I do recall
time?
that the industry felt that it wasn't going to be equitable across their sector. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Cochrane. We'll go to Senator Bush-Wilson.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Look, just so a technical question you may or may not be able to answer it. Our previous witnesses may have been able to answer it as well. It was mentioned that the virus hasn't been detected with the mite at this point in time. Does that mean that even if Varroa spreads the virus, there won't be any virus? Like, does it have to be there at the inset of an incursion, or can it find the mites organically? Like, is it present in the environment, or does it have to come in with that imported
Yes.
incursion?
That's correct. It would. So there has been extensive testing on the mites that have been detected to date in terms of when the officers have been out doing surveillance and collecting samples. So those mites have been tested, and as you say, no detection of the viruses of concern, which is a really positive thing. In terms of its potential entry, then the entry point would be infected Varroa mite
Right.
on another incursion.
Okay, so even if we don't get on top of this in infestation or incursion now, it's not likely that we'll see the virus associated with this incursion.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So is there any other is there anything negative? What does it might affect productivity or something else without the virus? Is it still potentially creating externalities for the industry?
Much like a tick,
Right.
It's a parasite, so it's relying on the bees for nutrition. So feeding on their hemolymph, reducing their fitness, making them ill.
Right.
They're not as productive in the hive, and they eventually die out.
Okay, thank you. In relation to your submission, you talk a little bit about resourcing challenges already, but you mentioned contingency plans haven't been reviewed by technical experts, government or industry for several years. Further, the development of a suite of diagnostic protocols required for the highest priority exotic bee pests is yet to be undertaken. As Senator Colbeck said earlier, everyone's been on high alert for an incursion for some time and has been aware this would happen sooner than later. Why do you think that is the case, that there's still those deficiencies?
As the industry, as the honeybee representatives described before us, there's so much to be done in the preparedness space, and the investment doesn't always come in terms of looking at those things, making sure we've got the right contingencies in place for the incursions, etc. There has been a lot of work done in terms of investing in preparedness, but there can always be more, but we are constrained by the resourcing.
Okay, so in terms of resourcing, example, you talk about 16 biosecurity officers across Australia with specialised training around surveillance. How many have you an idea of how many you think we do need? If you've only got 16, do you want 60 or 600 or?
It's always a challenge to estimate the need because of the fluctuation in that need. But the challenge with bees is that it's not everyone's cup of tea when it comes to managing bees because of the risks that they present. So it does take a very special person to be a bee biosecurity officer. Those bee biosecurity officers, as you said, they're highly trained. They predominantly interact with the industry at the grassroots level with the producers. They talk to them about their obligations against not only the legislation but the code of practice, that voluntary code of practice that was mentioned. So they are an extension service as such, and you know, the investment from industry in those services has been really critical in creating the education and awareness needed. In terms of numbers, it's a challenge, and not every jurisdiction has the same level of bee production, but certainly they could always do with more resourcing. And you know, for a jurisdiction such as New South Wales that is so large and has a large component of the honeybee industry in Australia, most definitely they could do with some extras.
Okay. And so you mentioned voluntary code of conduct then, but I think it was the previous witnesses said that it varied from state by state. There are some mandatory codes of conduct.
That's right, yes. It does vary in terms of parts of that code that have been adopted under legislation. So New South Wales have adopted it in its entirety. But this comes back to each of the jurisdictions having their own legislation in relation to biosecurity. And yes, some are able to adopt it in parts, and some, as in New South Wales, have adopted it in full.
Okay. I asked the previous witnesses the same question around potential sources for the outbreak, and whether are you aware of any examples of illegally imported material being detected in Australia, like Queens or genetic material?
The example that the Chair, Stephen Target, mentioned is one that's familiar.
No others.
And
that
I'm
you're aware of?
not aware of any others, no.
Okay, thank you. And is it a risk that you feel should be better assessed? And obviously, we're dealing with foot and mouth disease with imported meat materials as one example there, but you don't see it as a high risk at all that someone could import materials in other ways?
There's always a possibility, and you know, we know from the information that the department does provide in terms of the detections at the border that they make, that they are wide and varied, and could impact multiple agricultural industries. It's with a plant pest, because they're diseases, they're either pathogens, so fungal pathogens, viruses, bacteria. We've got insect pests from all various orders and descriptions. It's very challenging to determine where that smoking gun is when there is a detection made, because it takes some generations for those organisms to establish and become aware, so that we become aware of them in our environment. So yeah, it's always can be problematic. There are tools available that allow us to try and narrow down where things have arrived from internationally, and that's through looking at the genetics of those organisms.
Okay, well, last question just in relation to this. Given that your body works across governments and has been intimately involved in this incursion, are you aware of any DPI investigating anything in regards to this potentially illegally imported material in New South Wales?
No,
in
I'm
relation
not
to
aware.
this? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bush-Wilson. Senator Cole.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, clearly there's a better awareness of, or a heightened alertness to it since, I think it was about 2009 or 10 when the Asian bee incursion occurred in around Cairns. I recall a lot of these discussions at that point in time. But the reality of it's much closer to home now that we've got an actual incursion. Do you share the view that we're still in the stage of it's possible to eradicate? And what sort of time frame would you need? Do you think we need to make to get through to sort of clear that, bearing in mind we're coming into what's an active time for bees coming out of winter, and the hives are obviously going to be much more active now?
So there's two criteria that are applied when assessing whether or not an organism is a good candidate for eradication, and they include technical feasibility and the cost beneficiality, and those criteria are considered every time the Consultative Committee for Emergency Plant Pests meets to discuss the Varroa incursion. And yes, it is still considered technically feasible and cost beneficial to eradicate. The number of infected premises is still at 99 and has been for the past 3 weeks, so that's a really positive sign that things have steadied, and the delimitation surveillance that the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries has been undertaking is effective, and demonstrates that we are on track for achieving eradication. The current response plan is in play for 100 days, which means there will be another response plan that will be developed and agreed to through that consultative committee and provided an agreement through the National Management Group, which will meet to decide.
So that would be within the next 20 days or so? 100 days, so we're 70 odd days in, was it?
The
So
100-day
within the next
period will
month.
be 1st of October from when the response plan was first agreed to, so there's still some time there, and New South Wales are certainly working really hard to develop that next iteration of the plan.
And that would be taking into account greater levels of activity of hives, bearing in mind the bees will be more active at this time of year.
Yes, the activities will again be based around what's happening in the biology, like you say, in terms of potential for bee movements. But they will continue on conducting surveillance to ensure that they're capturing all of the zeros that are necessary to provide that evidence of absence amongst bee populations.
Okay. In the context, you said before that you had 38 of your industries signed up to the deed. You've got 39 members, is that right?
That's right.
Who are we missing?
There's one industry that is yet to sign. So there's a process that industries undertake in terms of becoming a signatory to the deed, and there is one industry left that hasn't become a signatory at this point.
Are they critical to this process?
Yes, they are. And we have been having discussions with them around what that looks like for them, and it has been an ongoing conversation with that industry. It can be a challenge for industries to, particularly because in the plant industry sector, there's a lot of variability in terms of their capability and how they're resourced. So some are quite small and some are much larger, but yes, we're working with that industry.
Is it positive?
Yes.
I don't really want to put anyone on the chopping block if I don't need to, and I notice you're being cautious, so it is concerning that they're critical though to the process.
Chair, can I just ask that question?
Sure.
We've also got 10 associates as well. Are they also encouraged to be part of arrangements or through the deed?
The associate membership is slightly different to being a full member, so they don't have the ability to become a signatory to the deed because they're not a peak industry body. So they're often RDCs or entities such as CSIRO, etc. So they become an associate member so that they can keep connected with what's happening through activities at PHA, but they're not signatories. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right. Okay. Do you have any assessment of what sort of additional resource level you might need off the back of this? And I'm really interested in the concept of going back over what you've had to do and the resources that have been required to achieve what appears to be a good situation right now, and noting the previous evidence that if it had been more than one location or one state, it would have been a much more difficult ballgame with perhaps even a different assessment of possibility for eradication. what do you think it would take to do a serious review of, let's say, the 100 days for the first cycle, and making sure that we've got, or start building the tools to be in a better position for further incursions, given that, you know, we thought we were ready, but once it all hit us, we weren't where we thought we were.
We have conducted some consideration around what figures are needed to implement both the National Bee Biosecurity Program as well as the National Bee Surveillance Program. So in the context of the Bee Biosecurity Program, which is that post-border program that has the bee biosecurity officers that engage with the producers, it's currently funded to the tune of $436,850 per annum. We estimate that a figure of approximately $1.4 million per annum would see delivery of a program that is better furnished to provide what the necessary steps to keep us free from Varroa in the event that we're going to eradicate this current incursion. And this figure would support a full-time equivalent in 6 states and half of a person in the Northern Territory, as well as the national coordination and communication efforts that are required. So that's one area of the activities that are happening in terms of the preparedness space. The other is the surveillance program, and again we've estimated it's currently at $750,000 per annum. We estimate anywhere between 2.1 or 2.8 million is required.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Colbeck. Senator Ciccone.
Thanks a lot, Chair, and thanks for coming tonight. Just wanted to ask quickly, following on from Senator Colbeck's questions, with the deed, how many times have we utilised it for, as a response towards something like Varroa? You able to just explain that to me?
I am.
How that deed is actioned, I guess, and how many times we've utilised that?
Certainly. So I might explain the deed just in its basic sense. It's a legal arrangement, a legal cost-sharing arrangement that allows us to respond to things quickly and bring all of the affected parties to the table for shared decision-making. In terms of its activity or how often it's been invoked, it was ratified in October of 2005, and very quickly in 2006 it was tested with the first plant pest incursion, sugarcane smut. And we have seen a steady increase over time of plant pest incursions that the deed has been applied to. And I can defer to my colleague, Dr. Suzanne Andreessen, who is the General Manager for Emergency Response and looks after the deed area.
Thank you, Sarah. So the exact number of response plans that have been implemented under the Emergency Plant Pest Response Deed that relate to bees, we've had Varroa jacobsoni in 2016, Varroa jacobsoni in 2019 and in 2020, and now we have Varroa. Both of those were very successfully eradicated, and Varroa destructor. There have been a number of other response plans, successful response plans under the Emergency Plant Pest Response Deed. I do apologise, I don't have the exact number. I believe it's around 15, but we can take that on notice and provide it to you.
Incursion in cairns to some extent, so that's another one.
That one wasn't actually, from my understanding, under the EPPRD.
Yeah, okay, I'll have to go back and read my reports on that.
How often is the document updated?
Yeah. Okay, so we actually have quite a, I guess, a program of activities that look at the review and then the update. So formally it's reviewed every 5 years, and we've just gone through in 2020 with the results coming out of that, discussed amongst the signatories and variations made to the deed, which we've actually got currently in train. But yes, so we've had three formal reviews every 5 years. We also hold incident debriefs after or during each response, and we've done a number of those. And Varroa destructor will also be subject to a incident debrief, and when that's from a national perspective, The jurisdictions, without a doubt, will probably be doing, New South Wales doing their own incident debrief from operational aspects. So when we do those reviews, when we do those debriefs, we get some lessons coming out of the responses. We then consult with our membership, with the signatories to the EPPRD, and we look at improvements. We look at what needs to change, what worked well. It's not just about what went wrong, but what actually went well, and we want to carry forward. And we also share and socialise those with our counterparts at Animal Health Australia. We work quite closely with them too.
Okay. And look, forgive me, I know in your opening statement you mentioned about plant plan. Can you just explain to me what that is?
So plant plan it's a schedule by reference to the EPPRD. It's more operational, so it provides guidance on the ground. So it's basically a consistent general response plan, non-specific response plan that guides operational activities on the ground.
Advice to whom?
Any response plan. So any response, plant plan provides guidance on operationally what should happen on the ground, both for the lead agency but also for industry parties.
Okay. So I guess, how does the National Biosecurity Strategy, how do you think it would assist in better managing these biosecurity threats in the future? We talk about learning, but going forward, how do you see that biosecurity strategy benefiting the industry going forward and the other sort of 39, 38 PIBs and 10 associates?
The National Biosecurity Strategy, I think, is a key step forward for us as a nation to be united across government, industry and community, so it takes us to that next step. We have those other agreements between governments that are in place, the IGAB for biosecurity. National Biosecurity Strategy just takes it that step further. It offers the guiding principles, it gives us an anchor point. And as I mentioned, we also deliver a document called the National Plant Biosecurity Strategy, which has been around since 2010 and was reviewed and released again in 2020. So the plant industries have most definitely been working extremely hard to ensure that they have those guiding principles and documents in place, because there are so many threats in the plant world and so many hosts, so many potential hosts for those threats. We have to really work hard on things like surveillance activities, our preparedness activities, and how we diagnose things, because often the diagnostics for these organisms is untested, and the scientists will develop those protocols usually on the run when there's an incursion to something, because they just haven't been developed previously.
I know you touched on the need, I guess, for stronger partnerships, and I think that's sort of the heart of the strategy, but stronger partnerships with industry and community groups. I'm just mindful too that organisations like yourselves are sort of membership based, and you're either a member or you're not. Those that aren't members, how do we, or how do you and your team actually engage with those people who aren't, I guess, in the tent, so to speak? Mm-hmm. Especially in times like this at the moment where we're trying to deal with very serious threats.
We have an inclusive approach, because even though we are a membership organisation, it doesn't preclude us from working with other industry groups that may not be representative organisations, or we will work with individuals, non-members and others where there are priorities for investment and they wish to do something and see the value of us bringing the right people to them in that project and creating the partnerships.
So how do you deal with the non-members then?
We engage with them through a variety of means. Our website provides many resources that are freely available and are updated frequently. We will respond to requests where there is perceived gap in knowledge. So recently we offered a webinar on foot and mouth disease and the potential impacts that will have on mixed producers, because often producers will have livestock and plant production happening on their properties. So where there's a need or a knowledge gap, we do like to step in there and try and fill it.
Have there been times where you've had to refuse membership or not allow a organisation to be an associate member?
So membership of PHA is based on a vote of all members. So we don't, that is not our role as such. We facilitate that process, but we don't have a decision point in that process.
So a vote of commodity members, so grains, for example.
So all of our members have a voting weight based on their local value of production. It's calculated on a 3-year rolling average, and yes, the voting rights are assigned to that LVP range.
So it is the case that it has happened that groups can be excluded.
If the members don't support the application, then that is a potential outcome, yes.
What would be the reasons, I guess, for not wanting people in the tent? Is that I don't know, organisation that may want to apply doesn't conform to certain criteria that's been set out by the current membership?
I guess I'm not in the head of the people voting in these instances, but they would have varied reasons. So
Are they made public?
no.
And is the performance of, I guess, the industry members reviewed in terms of, I guess, how they're been handling situations like Varroa, for instance? Is there, you talk about 3-year membership, but is there an ongoing review about the members themselves, whether they're fit to be members?
As long as they meet the criteria of being the peak industry body or the representative organisation. Obviously, when members join PHA, we establish that working relationship, and it's very strong with all of our members. We have memoranda of understanding with them. I mentioned the Plant Health Australia levy, which 23 of those 39 industries have negotiated and raised. So there's ongoing communication and input and guidance, and we talk to them about what their concerns are and where the investment falls.
You mentioned about criteria. What's the criteria? Is that public?
Sorry, criteria in the sense of?
You made reference to criteria before, but those 39 members.
Oh, in terms of whether or not they
being a
meet
member.
the criteria of
Yeah.
a peak industry body
Yeah.
or a representative organisation.
Yes. Is that public?
Yes.
So then if someone does apply, but is not back, surely there's got to be some grounds as to why that organisation would be not back? Do they not conform to the criteria that's been set out?
Yes, potentially that could be an outcome. But as I said, it's the voting rights of members that determine whether or not membership applications are successful.
And I'm assuming that's done at an AGM?
Yes, general meeting and AGM. We host 2 a year.
I'm happy to leave that there for now, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ciccone. I just had one final question, unless there are others. I just want to ask about the budget. I believe the 2021-22 budget included around $67 million for biosecurity preparedness. Part of that included more training and exercises to respond to pest and disease incursions. Are you involved in any of that, the rollout of that funding?
I believe we are. I would have to take that on notice
if you
in
could-
terms of additional information.
About what you're doing exactly in there, if you could take that on notice and where that's up to. And just finally, what happens, I mean, you cover a lot of industries or a lot of different types of farming. How does it work for a farmer that might produce a number of different goods that cover your area? How do you provide assistance to them?
So we work primarily through those peak industry bodies and provide them with the tools that they need to communicate back out to their membership. But again, not everyone is a member of a peak industry body, so we want to make sure that we're covering producers as far and wide as we can. So as I said, our website offers a whole host of and suite of materials that are available free to all members of the public and producers. We have in partnership with Animal Health Australia, the Farm Biosecurity Program, which is an initiative that has been in place now for over a decade and, yes, really works to bring that biosecurity awareness at the grower level.
Okay. And just in terms of bees in particular, it seems to me, I didn't get a chance to ask RPIC, I think, is that the right?
Yes,
Is that
yeah.
I didn't get the R. Didn't get a chance to ask them, how do you deal with the fact that there are a lot of bee producers, presumably are hobbyists and don't necessarily consider themselves primary production producers, probably won't join a peak body. How do you get messaging to them about what they need to do to protect against these things?
I think the fortunate thing about those people that are hobbyists or recreational beekeepers, they are very passionate about health of bees. So they're a receptive audience and they are keen to know information. And we do have an online training course for bees specifically. So we have an e-learning platform and that is around bee biosecurity, and the majority of the participants in those training or in that training are non-commercials, so the hobbyists.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. If there are no further questions, I thank you for your time today or this evening. I think there was at least one question taken on notice, and to remind people that they are due by Thursday the 22nd of September. Thank you very much, and I will now welcome, hang on, I'm heading ahead of myself. I will welcome Grain Producers Australia, and just wait for them to get to the table. Going further. Good evening, gentlemen. I understand too that you've been providing information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to the Senate. For the Hansard record, could you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Andrew Wiedemann, I'm the R&D spokesman for Grain Producers Australia currently.
Colin Bettles, Chief Executive of Grain Producers Australia.
Thank you both. I invite you to make a short opening statement, if you would like, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And thank you for providing Grain Producers Australia with the opportunity to present our members' views at the hearing of the Senate, the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport References Committee's inquiry into the adequacy of the Australian biosecurity measures and response preparedness. GPA represents the interests of Australian grain producers on national policy, collaborating and engaging with industry and government stakeholders to help deliver a more profitable, sustainable and globally competitive Australian grains industry. As a not-for-profit company limited by guarantee, GPA is governed by a board of grower-elected directors who represent the nation's major grain-producing regions and skills-based directors. Our membership comprises of director producer members and producer members of the Grains Councils of state farming organisations throughout Australia who represent their members' interests to the GPA Policy Council and other subcommittees, including the GPA Biosecurity Committee. GPA has responsibilities representing the interests of Australia's 22,500 levy-paying grain producers, which are legitimised under federal legislation. This includes managing biosecurity for industry through Plant Health Australia as a signatory to the Emergency Pest Plant Response Deed. We're also a joint representative organisation responsible for overseeing the Grains Research and Development Corporation's performance and strategic investment, with matched federal government funding in RD&E activities and under the PERD Act. GPA also has representative and managing the risk of chemical residues and environmental contaminants in grain products to help facilitate access to domestic and export markets and protect product integrity and export reputation via the National Residue Survey. Grain growers contribute 1.02% of their net crop sales towards levies comprising the GRDC, the EPIRD responsibilities, Plant Health Australia membership and the National Residue Survey, which controls the MRL testing of grain. The GRDC's combined investment with grower levies and matching government funds equals about $200 million per year, including a large portion on biosecurity. GRDC's 2021 annual report showed $30.9 million was spent on biosecurity, representing 18% of its RD&E portfolio. The 2017 Craik report highlights GPA's long-standing partnership with PHA as an example of leadership in biosecurity. With our industry taking greater ownership for biosecurity issues, which can drive with limited or no government involvement through the Grains Biosecurity Farm Biosecurity Program. As the Crake report says, this collaboration provides a ready source of funds to pay the grains industry share of approved emergency response plans and is drawn on to cover costs associated with incursions such as Capra beetle and Varroa. Capra beetle is the grains industry's FMD, or the lumpy skin issue. Funds collected under the EPIRD levy can also be used for purposes relating to emergency plant pests within the meaning of the EPIRD, such as surveillance. The report also says the grains industry's decisions to set the two levies at a rate above the minimum required were a positive example for other industries to follow and showed industry leadership in strengthening biosecurity activities. The award-winning Grains Farm Biosecurity Program, managed by PHA and GPA, provides of offices in 5 states: New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia, who provide access to practical resources and accurate information to help growers manage biosecurity risks in their own businesses. For example, growers can access training opportunities, on-farm signage, fact sheets, biosecurity planning tools and risk assessment guides, amongst other things. Data provided by the Australian Grain Export Innovation Centre shows there has been a significant increase in the size and value of the Australian crop, which coincides with the start of this levy collection system more than 30 years ago. In the late 1980s, the gross value of crop production was only around 4 billion, but growth in value means it now reaches 20 billion. AGIC says additional grains production since the early 2000s has not come from increased planting of crops, rather the increase in production is attributable to the persistent increase in crop yields. This data shows the national grains industry has grown significantly in size and value, and the level of investment in critical areas such as biosecurity, management and preventions needs to keep pace with this growth and adapt to modern challenges with flexible systems and appropriate funding streams. The threats from biosecurity are also growing as not only our local production increases, but also the size and complexity of global trade and human movement. GPA's biosecurity advocacy accurately recognises these increasing demands and that we need tougher preventative measures with appropriate resourcing to protect growers, rural communities and the national economy against the social and economic impacts of devastating pests and incursions. For example, Capra beetle could cause an estimated $15.5 billion worth of damage over 20 years and a loss of access to important grain export markets for Australian farmers. GPA has advocated for the introduction of a levy on all imported containers entering Australia. In response to these escalating demands and complex challenges, we continue to support this. GPA has not had any direct involvement in formal emergency management activities in response to the recent threat of foot and mouth lumpy skin disease. However, the overwhelming public and political reaction to the potential impacts, not only to the Australian farmers and industry, but also the national economy and for rural communities, has created a heightened awareness amongst our members and the critical importance of biosecurity and the need for greater and more urgent action. Many grain producers like myself are also livestock producers and have used the current FMD and LSD situation to better understand the relevant impacts of what proactive steps they can take to implement enhanced biosecurity protections within their own farm businesses. GPA is also aware that while the public's current focus on biosecurity is related to 2 major animal health threats, in reality, a plant health disease could arrive before any of these, and therefore complacency is never an option for us. That's why we continue to engage with our members actively on biosecurity to do all we can to keep Australia free of such pests and diseases which pose significant threats for the Australian grain producers, our industry, rural communities and businesses and the national economy. When it comes to biosecurity, more can always be done, and we need to remain vigilant in order to properly protect individuals and the public good. The first response from our grower members is that they don't want any of these threats arriving here in the first place. The biosecurity signs people see across the country are a part of our program to highlight and support the importance of biosecurity, starting at the farm gate as well as the front gate to Australia. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Wiedemann. I might just quickly start where we have been focused a lot tonight on the biosecurity at the border and the way of potentially funding increased surveillance. I take it from your evidence that you believe any levy should apply to containers only, not to bulk goods. Is that correct?
That
So
is
we're
co-
bulk
that-
wheat or bulk coal or iron ore, etc.
In essence, our main issue with containers is the fact that they can be on one part of the world 6 weeks ago, and they can turn up at the local packing house in my own town of Rapagna in 6 weeks' time, and the potential is for a potential incursion. We've long supported an introduction of a levy on containers only and specifically, because they're seen as our biggest threat to our industry, purely by the nature of where they've been. Now, in the $270 million that the previous government announced in terms of surveillance, there was an indication that some of the enabling technologies that may be able to be used to look at where containers have been in the 4 or 5 visits prior, having known to be in Capra beetle areas, for instance. I mean, as I've said, that's our massive issue for us. Although, I mean, the impact of FMD and the lumpy skin would also have a major impact on grain providers as well. So that can't be underestimated. But in terms of us, you know, Capra is our big issue. And in terms of protection, we've, on all of the incursions that we've seen and been a part of with government agencies, and in being able to, at this stage, be able to pick that up before they've become an issue for our industry, it's always gone back to the stage of where that container has come from in a previous shipment movement. And so that's our issue about why we're really passionate about making sure that containers are fumigated, in particular from knowing they've been somewhere in those areas in the last 4 or 5 trips.
Have you, well, just on that point actually first, do you know what percentage of containers are fumigated that have been in those high-risk areas for Capra beetle?
Look, we'd have to take that question on notice, because it's not something that we
is
have
seen,
in-
if the department knows that a container has been in a high-risk area, will they elevate that, or will they seek to fumigate it as a matter of course?
Look, again, this is an area that has been a long discussion point with the department through PHA as well, and other plant industry and other members of the National Management Group when we've been looking at you know, where these things have come into the country. So again, it's a point that we would have to probably come back to you with information on.
And I was just going, my final question before I hand over, I was going to ask, were you involved in discussions around introducing a container, well, I think it was more than containers, but an import type levy a few years ago? It got quite advanced there, but there was a number of interest groups opposed to it, given the extra costs to be put on the supply chain. Were you involved at all in those discussions?
We've been involved in the instigation of trying to get something up. At the end of the day, as a farmer, we pay. And so from the protection point of view, a minimal cost and probably placed at the export point as a part of that certification would potentially be the most appropriate. Now, under a levy-based arrangement, I'm sure that can be implemented as on an export charge component, and so that we're actually then looking at how we can fund a scheme that can actually fumigate these properly.
And there were a number of supporters of such a scheme. It got very far advanced, I remember, in government.
Yeah.
Do you have, given you were involved in discussions, is there any lessons you took out of what we could do differently to overcome any political opposition that probably failed due to a bit of a political firestorm? So is there any lessons you took out of that debate going forward?
Look, I've been involved in biosecurity matters for previously Grains Council Australia and then Grain Producers Australia, which is the same organisation, for some 14 years. I think what we've seen in the last probably 5 or 6 years is a heightened dedication around biosecurity for a range of factors. And again, I think it's really about communicating the reasons as to why we need to be more vigilant, in particular in this day and age when markets are so sensitive around the world, and even just the mention of Capra in news articles here can have that potential of us having to look at eradication, proving free again. So, I mean, there's a lot of statements that come out that can be quite dangerous to us as an industry, and in purely having to state that we are free. So, and other countries around the world take note of what goes on here. And I think, again, in all of that, communication with all of the stakeholders is important. And I would hope that, you know, through the next few months and that we'd be able to sort this out, because all of the planned industry groups and others have supported having some level of container levy in place.
Thank you for that. Senator Colbeck.
Thanks, Chair. Are there any, I'll go to the capra beetle first, the vectors for that from your perspective, as you understand them. So the key vectors for obviously travelling on a container, but how's that manifest?
Yeah, so with containers, and this is interesting because about 20 years ago there was an incursion in Western Australia, and capra beetle was found in a Scottish skirt, I think, that came in, and it was found, and it wasn't that far from a grains facility.
Scottish skirt.
Yeah, and a sporran.
Oh, right.
So, yeah, anyway, there was the house in Western Australia where it was found. I mean, the people at least reported it, thankfully, and it was eradicated. And it was, so that's where that came in. That came in through that. We've had other areas.
So it came in a package in a container. It didn't necessarily come on a container.
No, it came in it. Yeah, all of the incursions we're aware of currently, to my knowledge, have all come inside of a container. The recent, and it didn't get past the point of surveillance because it was picked up before it went out, but was brought in refrigerators. But generally speaking, most of the issues we find come in the wooden container, floored containers, where eggs are laid, and again it goes back when they're doing the trace back. It goes back to the fact that these containers have come from known capra areas, but maybe 4 or 5 trips ago, not that trip. I think when it comes, and probably to Senator Canavan's question before, when it comes from a direct known area, I think there is a heightened perception by the department in terms of that. But it's that 4 or 5 trips that have been unknown, and that's where the surveillance of tracing and tracking the containers is so important in terms of us in preventative measures.
Okay, so that puts a slightly different dimension on it, because treating, best form of prevention is to stop it leaving in the first place.
Correct.
But if it's 4 or 5 incarnations of or trips of the container ago, it's impossible for us to say, well, before a container that's been in a zone comes here, because we won't necessarily know where the container's been those 4 or 5 trips ago.
That's correct.
Are you suggesting going forward there could be some kind of NLIS type tag for containers? That you'd have a database, and container, we could just scan it, and the biosecurity officials could see where it's been over the last few months?
Look, I mean, I think that's where modern agriculture is moving towards anyway. I mean, we need to have that in terms of the whole supply chain, not barcodes on everything, but essentially for a lot of the things that we're doing in terms of traceability in the industry revolves around using these new enabling technologies that are coming through. And that trace back, most containers already have a coding on them so that they can be actually identified, but it's the systems that are to support that, to acknowledge where a container's come from. And you've got to get not just Australia on board, you've got to get other countries on board.
So this
is a very broad question around how
is there an active piece of work globally to progress this?
Look, again, I'd have to take that on notice.
I'll leave that there. Sorry, Senator Colbeck.
And that, but to me, it's an important facet that we have to try and manage this, and because of the potential for not only that, but there's carnal bunt and there's other things out there that can be a very severe impact on our industry, as on the grains industry. But then that impact is also then measured across other industries because of the impact on another one. Similar with the varroa mite on the grains industry as well, because we do have a lot of pollinated crops, particularly beans and canola, and we're really quite aware of the importance of bees in that whole environmental potential.
Yeah, just for the witness purposes, I think our next witness is on the TV there, which I think he's welcome to be on, given it's a public hearing, but he won't interfere with your evidence until we get to the Almond Board. Back to you, Senator Colbeck, sorry.
Thanks, Chair. So effectively what we have at this point in time is an understanding through the current container ID systems of where it might have been, and then we can apply a biosecurity risk rating to it based on that. Yeah. That's effectively the information that we have at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And then requirement desire, I suppose, desire for further development of technologies to give us better information?
Well, look, I mean, I think we've seen the development of X-ray equipment that's been beneficial, particularly in the container sector, and but again, with grains being a bulk commodity, it's more about, well, where does that container come from, come up country, the level of, at the local level, and it's interesting because we obviously have 6 packers, grain packers that are packing lentils, beans, chickpeas, wheat, barley, canola in our local area of the Wimmera where I farm, and you know the learnings there and talking to the people that are managing the containers is that, you know, they do inspections, but they're not doing an inspection per se to be able to pick up the tracing of eggs and things in some of these containers in the grains industry. But then on top of that, you've got retail goods coming into Australia, which is where we've had our issues. And then also understanding where the liability stops and starts with some of these organisations that are opening the containers, and their understanding about how you know, reporting and other things. And I see that as an area where we have to continually educate you know, those importers of goods, because we're seeing a larger array of importation of goods from right around the globe coming into the Australian market.
I think one of the things that's continually raised with us is about the shared responsibility of biosecurity, but I think the idea behind this container levy is more around shared accountability as well. At our Policy Council meeting in July, where all our state members gathered, we had a presentation from Andrew Tung, who's the former head of biosecurity at the department, and he really outlined the complexity of human movement and the movement of trade across the globe. And I think for these issues, for us, it gets back to that there's a clear benefit in investing more in the preventative measures. I think it was stemming from the Crake report as well, and that for every dollar invested in preventative, it saves $30 in eradication. And our members continually tell us they just don't want these pests and diseases coming here to start with. And with the FMD and Varroa and lumpy skin disease being front of mind at the moment, it's an opportunity to really focus on what are the pragmatic tools and investments that we can put in place to protect growers. And there's also a shared outcome of the any devastating impacts to the economy and communities as well. So, and that's essentially what we're asking for.
I know you focused largely in your evidence on containerised freight, but what would you see the risks are in bulk movements?
Well, in general terms,
because that was one of the, as Senator Canavan said, was one of the issues that was in the previous proposal, was getting some agreement around how we manage bulk.
In answering Senator Canavan's question as well, look, we, to my knowledge, we haven't done any analysis of that, but we would certainly welcome being involved in a working group with stakeholders to really look at the details of that. We haven't had it properly explained to me, at least, the reasons why the container levy was rejected or not implemented, and we think whether it was some practicalities around systems. But we'd like to think that we could find ways to overcome that, to implement it, given that the benefits that it can deliver not only for growers in our industry but the broader public as well.
I think the thing with bulk goods, though, it's generally not something that's going up country, so the risk is at the port. And so at that port inspection, I mean, every ship has to go through surveillance, and we're aware of ships that do fail inspection, and they have to be recleaned. So we take on board that I think our inspectors are pretty good when it comes to that, and we've certainly seen, in my own state where ships have been rejected, sent it back out to be cleaned, and then to come back in. So I think in general terms, we don't see probably bulk as being that bigger risk, but containers are.
I mean, yeah, okay, from my perspective, I suppose the point would be there's an appropriate process to deal with each.
It would.
And whether that be based on per vessel and that vessel inspection, which obviously has its impact, versus the capacity of containers to move much more broadly.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So they would be the two elements of risk from your point of view?
Yeah, they would be, definitely.
Yeah, okay. We're getting close to time, Chair. I'm happy to...
Okay, thank you, Senator Colbeck. We'll go to Senator Whish-Wilson.
Yeah, just two quick questions for me. So I think a couple of my questions have been covered. You say you found the Grain Producers Australia's found the Varroa mite processes to be adequate, and that's helped you meet your formal representative obligations for all paying grain producers. Have you got any idea roughly what you'd apportion towards the Varroa mite response from your producers?
Yeah, look, it's something we'll have to take on notice in terms of the overall, but have you got the numbers?
Yeah, I've been involved in the process. We can provide you the details, but we found the process, obviously.
Oh, the processes.
Yeah, that where as Plant Health Australia explained before, that Grain Producers Australia, as one of the members of that process or one of the affected parties, comes into a discussion, and our role then is to go and get the technical information about the impacts on production. Now we weren't impacted at the front line, so in the zone around Newcastle, where the incursion was, that there wasn't any actual impact on any growers. It's more of a secondary impact on bees used to
For pollination services?
Yeah.
For pollination services? Or?
Yeah, for hybrid canola seed production.
Right.
And we go into a process where we consult with technical experts and other people across industry, like the GRDC and Dr. Rowan Rainbow, who works for us on contract, and we bring their skill and experience into the discussion to work out what the actual impact is on our production, and then we go away and then you have a discussion about the funding mechanisms, and we did ask what the actual economic impact may be at some stage in the future, but there's a lot of variables that we can't answer yet that still need to play out, but we're certainly contributing to the response effort through the deed arrangement. So as I said, we found that satisfactory.
In general, history shows that the National Management Group, which has been spoken about before, works very well, really, in terms of trying to get to the bottom of, how those cost sharings would work out, but also the overall cost ratios as well. But there could be, to my mind, there could be some improvements in the way that the implementation of the process around eradication could be competitively tendered for. What we tend to find a lot, in my experience, has been that states generally, because they're not the holders of a lot of the cash, tend to have some inflated costs, I believe, in my experience, and then this takes a bit of negotiation firmly, because we do have experienced people from a lot of the industries, a lot of those member industries of the EPIRD deed involved. It's important to have that at the table, because to rationalise and go through where they've put those costs in, and we've generally got a pretty good outcome, I feel, but it does rely a lot on experienced people being around the table.
Okay, because the next witness is interesting. The Almond Board of Australia have raised the point, which I thought was interesting, that participation in the emergency plan pest response deed is voluntary. Therefore, there's free riders in the system. Basically, there's industries that don't that choose not to participate and don't pay anything, yet they benefit from everyone's work on control measures. Do you share similar
I think
views or concerns?
In the plant industry, and certainly in the grains industry, the forebears actually established Plant Health Australia. So, originally, so their vision about what needed to be done provides evidence, I think, of why we're involved. And then from the grain sector, every grain farmer pays a levy, and that's a reasonable, not only reasonable, but I think a very fair way of us all contributing collectively towards what has proved to be a very successful partnership between not only the producer, but all of the government, state and federal, in terms of the way that those costs have been shared out over the history, over the journey. Now, look, going forward, we're continually looking at how we review the amount of funding that we're getting out of that process, and whether that's adequate enough to fund the activities we do. It costs somewhere around $800,000 a year to run the Grains Biosecurity offices and manage those. And again, every dollar spent on preparedness, as the Craik reports highlighted, means that we're resolving a lot of the Curie action of costs. And again, it's all about prevention. But we've been involved also in some simulation work, and we did some simulation work about 7 years ago now, in Victoria on Carnarvon as a simulation. They are very important measures that the industry undertakes, and they do come at a cost because it's essentially the same as if you had an outbreak. And so looking and learning from that is really important, I feel, for everybody in the whole supply chain when you do those incursion and specific activities around those.
Just on the concept of the free rider factor, though, that's something that we're quite familiar with in our industry.
Yep.
So we have those responsibilities under legislation, as Andrew mentioned in our opening statement,
Yep.
to all growers who pay a levy. So they're compulsory levies that go to research and development,
Yep.
to the GRDC, Senator Colbeck's familiar with it, and to Plant Health Australia. So we represent growers who pay to be members of state farming organisations. We also have direct members.
Yep.
So when we make decisions, it impacts all growers, and we'd welcome them all to be members of GPA, but we're often told that's a form of compulsory unionism, so we don't get any money directly to GPA from the levy, although some farm groups would prefer to get a slice of that.
Okay. I suppose I was being a bit cheeky because I mean, obviously you can talk about container levies and other ways of raising money to help share the burden or help fund the burden. But if some industries like yours or cotton industries tend to be the ones providing the funding from their members towards this, I'm just wondering if there's any other industries that you're aware of that aren't kicking in and providing their fair share.
Again, I think the grains industry is probably the most developed group within the EPIRD arrangements and probably has the greater capacity, given the size of the nature of the crop, to generate equitable funding around this. So in terms of other groups, I think, again, most groups are all a part of it. I think, as PHA have said, there's one group that's not. So, but I think in general terms, most people are a party to it.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wilson. Senator Ciccone.
Thanks very much, Chair. Look, I just want to ask the impact of varroa in the detection in New South Wales. What would be the impact in dollar terms on the industry?
On the grains industry
grains,
itself?
Yeah.
Look, again, I think we'd have to come back with a more appropriate answer. We'd have to come back to you with that.
Well, there was no immediate impact.
No.
From the work that we did discussing with the experts, the impacts, and that is that pollination is used as a yield impact. So the opportunity is there if people want to use pollination on their crop to increase yield. But we understand it's practice that's not used, and definitely there was no impact around the affected zone.
Yeah, okay. I know we've had a bit of a discussion around levies, but I just wanted to pick up in your submission. You say that you were extremely disappointed by the previous government's response on the biosecurity imports levy that was proposed at the time. Why do you say that?
Just the failure to follow through. I guess it was something that we supported and still support. And I don't think there was a clear answer back to the people involved in the process. And then since then, you've what do you call it? There's attachment one I've got here. What is it? The Plant Industries Forum has sent a letter to Minister Watt. How often? And you also mentioned about the Biosecurity Committee. How often has that met? So you mentioned in June, was it June this year?
Yeah, so it's been meeting, and obviously when I was chair of Grain Producers Australia, we established that committee in 2020.
In 2020?
So that was established in 2020. And that was to bring together all of the states together to talk more about biosecurity matters and also to continue to bring and educate people through to transition into people that are sitting here in the chair. So trying to educate people from our sector.
So
about
has that
biosecurity.
committee only met once in the last 3 years?
No, it's met, we'd have to come back to the exact number, but it's met at least twice a year, either by virtual because of COVID, and we've had face-to-face meetings. I think we've had 2 face-to-face meetings in that period. But COVID's obviously played.
Where would you normally have the face-to-face ones then?
Beg pardon?
Where would you normally have those face-to-face meetings?
Generally coinciding with where we can have policy council meetings as well.
Okay. How do you engage with, I guess, the broader grains supply chain then, given the role that you have in terms of all the other organisations in the supply chain?
On biosecurity
Yeah,
specifically?
biosecurity, yes.
Well, I suppose there's a number of areas. I mean, Grains Australia is a process that's been set up around market access, and that includes GRDC and Grain Trade Australia. So that, look, to quantify the exact number of processes would be an interesting question. But given how prominent biosecurity is across the business, and with GRDC, we're having ongoing discussions with them around research and development. The National Residue Survey, there are things with regards to market access that we're in constant conversations with other stakeholders about.
So I guess what specific steps have you undertaken since the, since Varroa's incursion? What steps have you taken to engage, I guess, with the industry, with folks in grains?
Well, probably a good litmus test is the phone calls that we get from our members. So we had direct phone calls from the policy managers at some of our state farming members, and we put out a communication early on to our members to update them on the situation. And I think that also the state governments themselves are in contact with the individual state farming organisations, given it's not just grains, and grains is only has a minor impact. I think that some of the other commodity groups, like that's one of the benefits of GPA, is that our state members have also those cross-commodity policy work that they do and responses. So I'm pretty confident that that was handled through New South Wales farmers, for example. They would have a horticultural committee and policy people there working to keep them involved. And if there was any concern from our members, they also know that our role quite clearly is to Plant Health Australia, so there's an open process of communication there that's ongoing. To get to your question about how often the biosecurity committee's met, it is weighed up against other priorities, so quite often we send out a communication requesting whether or not there's any need to meet. And so we would make periodically, depending on how that's weighed up with other priorities such as Policy Council or our Pesticides and Technology Committee and any number of other projects that we may be working on or engagement that we're doing with a range of stakeholders.
Yeah,
I think it's also fair to say that the National Management Group also puts out information which we pass down the supply chain to all of our members where it's available to do so. I think in the early days, a lot of this work that's done at the National Management Group, we all sign up to confidentiality arrangements, and so we can only talk about what all of the national group actually wants to put out in the public domain.
And
But have you done work on a strategy in terms of how you tackle Varroa, or in this? I know we've been focused on Varroa tonight, but FMD as well, and how that would impact.
Yes, so that's where the work around the costs, around the $15.5 billion impact on our industry comes from.
But you have a strategy in place to deal with that?
There are strategies in place working with PHA around all of these particular potential incursion issues that we might face as a production sector.
Okay. What have you identified as areas of improvement for within the biosecurity system, and what actions are you, undertaking for any of that improvements?
Well, again, it's all about prevention, and so clearly people coming into the country at the moment are obviously a real problem if they're coming from areas known to have been in areas around FMD, lumpy skin, all these things. And I think the bigger risk we have with LMD is the fact that it's a bacteria that can potentially float in the air, and whereas FMD seems to be more of a contact issue. So I think the learnings around that are that, again, prevention and spending as much money as we can afford to, because if we get any of these things in Australia, because of the nature of our industry as a major exporting country, we're in a world of pain if we don't stop it first. Mm-hmm. But again, having the prevention, and the question is similar to what we did with the Carnal Bund issue, is doing those simulation trials around what happens, and we're training people to be able to deal with that. And so there are very extensive work plans around all of these potential pests and diseases that have been worked on over quite a long period of time. The other thing that's also identified in a lot of these processes is the need to have the potential for particular chemicals to be made available should they be needed, and we actually hold a number of permits for those.
I was mindful of time, but could you just take on notice, you mentioned about the strategy. I don't know if you're able to provide us with a copy of that strategy. But can I also, just my last question, how do you manage, I guess, your biosecurity obligations as a member of the PHA, or being a PHA industry member?
Yep. How do we manage our obligations?
Yeah.
So essentially when there's an incursion or a pest, when we're notified through the NMG process, and then we obviously meet those obligations through our signature to the deed, and that's our current chairman Barry Large, myself and Colin are also signatures and are engaged in those meetings and as and when needed. We also bring to the table where required expert advice from, in particular, areas that we've needed entomology work and these types of things. So we get expert advice from outside of our group. But in most cases, the state governments that are generally running or are notified as the lead organisations in most of these actually provide expert advice anyway through that process.
Yeah, thank you. So I think attachment 1, there's pages that are probably mixed here at the moment, but I might hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ciccone. There is the opportunity to place questions on notice, and if you have taken questions on notice, please, if you could get them back to us by Thursday, the 22nd of September. With that, I really do thank you for your time this evening, gentlemen. Apologise for going
asking you some questions, Colin.
a little bit.
I was waiting for someone to raise that. Senator Sterle's not here.
None of us were took as much revenge as we could have, but thank you very much, Mr. Bettles and Mr. Wiedemann. Now,
Thank you,
I apologise to Mr. Jackson. We are running over time. We are just going to take a slight break to have a quick private meeting, Mr. Jackson, but we'll make sure the technology is working. This will not take long, and we'll finish this off quickly.
Yeah. Probably just need to outside here.
Yeah, we'll go completely outside, I suppose. Okay, well, I'll reconvene this hearing of Rural Affairs and Regional and Rural Affairs Transport Committee. I'll learn that soon. Now, we are next witnesses on video conference. So I welcome Mr. Tim Jackson from the Animal Almond Board Australia. Just checking, Mr. Jackson, the technology is working well. Can you hear us fine?
Yep, thank you.
Great. Now, I believe information on parliamentary privileges and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Yeah, Tim Jackson, CEO of the Almond Board of Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. I'll invite you to make a short opening statement, if you like, and then we'll go to questions.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity. Unlike the previous guest, I'm new to biosecurity. I haven't got the 14 years experience of gentlemen beforehand, but the Varroa experience over the last 10 weeks has been a very steep learning curve around the biosecurity challenges that we have within our nation. So since Varroa hit on June 22, our industry has been in turmoil in regard to accessing bees. So our industry is this year was due to throw a crop of about $1 billion worth across South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales, with one farm in WA. We're 100% reliant on bees for pollination. So without bees, crop potential is hugely impacted. And as I've said in my submission, our experience with the national response was that it was anything but a national response, and that it was fragmented into state interests and has potentially caused our industry hundreds of millions of dollars worth of production losses.
Well, thank you very much for that, Mr. Jackson. And I might actually just start. You have concluded?
Yep.
Yep, okay. I might just start there where you left off on that point. Sounds like you have been victims of the sort of COVID disease, if you like, that lines on a map drawn in the mid-19th century have determined the response to this disease. Can Can you just explain for me, so my understanding from your submission is that beehives, if you like, within New South Wales have been allowed to move, providing they're not in contained or quarantine areas. That was my takeaway, but they haven't been able to move those non-quarantined areas, if you like, haven't been able to move hives into, or bees into other states because those states have applied a statewide ban, if you like, on New South Wales. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep. So what happened was a national plan was put together where it balanced up the very, very real risk of varroa mite, but New South Wales DPI came up with a plan that isolated the risk to the area where the incursions were found, and then identified that there was an economic impact that was way beyond the risk around pollination of almonds. We need over 300,000 hives. So we need nearly every available beehive that is available for pollination from Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia into our orchards in August to affect pollination. So without that movement of New South Wales bees, we were left short.
Do you believe the state governments that imposed the ban on, the statewide ban on New South Wales, did they provide you with scientific or plant health evidence for the need for such a ban?
There was a lot of confusion around beehive numbers. So at one point there, for instance, in Victoria, they thought they had enough beehives in Victoria to cover, when in actual fact what emerged was that lots of beehives are double registered. So they're registered in Victoria and South Australia, so they were double counted. So there wasn't enough. So there was a lot of concern around movement of hives without any traceability. That was seemed to be the major sticking point around their risk appetite. Was there was an unknown around where the hives had been before they were coming across the border. So without any sort of national traceability system, it was very difficult for them to justify letting hives in.
So just so I've got that in my head, you're saying that they judged, or those state governments judged, that the risk to their own domestic almond production or other agricultural production was low because they had enough beehives internally, and they didn't need to take the risk of hives from New South Wales. Have I got that right?
That was an initial assessment, but we soon clarified that. So it was clear that we were going to be short.
And even after you clarified that, they haven't changed their stance, have they? And is it too late now for your
Yes.
growing season, if that's the right word, or planting season? Too late?
So basically, the bees have to be in the orchard during blossom. So we've had a perfect storm of the worst kind this year. Blossom normally goes for 4 weeks, but for some reason, due to the weather conditions and whatever else, the blossom only occurred for 2 weeks. And we had numerous orchards. You normally need 5 or 6 hives per hectare for when you have poor weather to make sure you maximise your pollination and your yield. This year, because of the very poor weather and the border restrictions, we've had a number of orchards with beehive stocking rates as low as 1.5 on their orchard. And then it's gone for 2 weeks instead of 4, so you've got less time for less bees to get around. So it's been an absolute disaster.
Thanks, Mr. Jackson. I'll hand over to Senator Colbeck.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mr. Jackson. So fundamentally what you're saying in terms of resolving the issues that you've found, a better coordination nationally of the plan, including across state borders.
Absolutely.
And much better or significant improvement in systems, so traceability, movement records, so effectively the records that are available or need to be available to facilitate the movement that you're looking for to achieve access to the hives.
That's right.
Need to be significantly upgraded.
Yeah, so our industry is certainly pushing for a a national traceability system where, for every truckload, 120 hives, they move normally in 120 hives on a truck, I'm told. So a QR code per 120. You just scan it when you start to move, you scan it at the other end, so there's a record of where it is. So there is some sort of independent verification of where the hives have been. It seems like bees go up and down the east coast. They're not stuck in, we've got Victorian bees who need to go to New South Wales for floral resources at the moment. They're too scared to take them over there in case they can't get them back.
Sounds like COVID.
It's exactly like COVID, except with bees, Senator.
Yeah, I was having a similar conversation with the refrigerated sector yesterday. So you're saying 300,000 hives required, is that right?
Yep. So our growth.
About how many did you end up getting?
Say in Victoria, which is 60% of our production, they got just over half of what they required across all their orchards. But some of those orchards, some of those major orchards, were down as low as 30% of their hives.
Okay. And a short blossom season.
Short blossom. We had the ridiculous situation where New South Wales allowed bees. They did a really good job of facilitating beehive movement from outside the quarantine zone. We had the Murray River there on one side, with orchards on one side of the Murray River in New South Wales with bees, and we had orchards on the other side of the river who weren't allowed to have the same bees.
Can the bees fly?
Did the bees know that?
Can the bees fly over the river? They would go that far?
Yeah,
Very good point.
The bees would travel, what, 3 to 5 k's if they were looking for something?
Up to 7.
Up to 7, yeah. Okay, so the river's not that wide.
So the ban there was no common sense in the ban, because if a bee on the New South Wales side of the border had varroa, Victoria would have been contaminated anyway.
Yeah.
Could I ask a question on that, just Senator Colbeck? Was there any Sentinel hives testing for that as a matter of interest?
There is clearly a resources issue across the various state agencies around what sort of testing measures they could put in place in a very short notice. To be fair, timing couldn't have been worse. June 22, and here we are needing 300,000 hives moved within a month. Made it really challenging for everyone. But we found it really frustrating as we tried to come up with biosecurity bubbles where we would isolate certain properties that only New South Wales bees could go to. We come up with all sorts of different ideas, but unfortunately, we couldn't get an appetite from the other states.
Did you end up getting any in from Queensland?
We were expecting 30,000. We got less than 5,000.
Okay. Because there was a protocol, as I understand it, being developed for the movement of hives from Queensland to Victoria to assist.
Yes, there was, but within the beekeeping community of Queensland, there was a genuine backlash around those hives returning and potentially bringing back varroa mite. So a lot of them were scared off going down there and coming back.
So a lot of the beekeepers themselves were, let's say, spooked by the possibility of infection of their hives, during the movement potentially.
Certainly in Queensland, not so in New South Wales, but certainly in Queensland, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And it would be too early yet to get a decent handle on the potential impact of the short flowering season and the shortage of bees.
Yep, so we're in the process of conducting a stocking survey of all our growers, and then we'll backtrack that with yields when they come next year, and then compare them to the previous years. But there's a fairly pessimistic outlook amongst a number of our growers.
And so of the $65 million cost that the industry across the board's looking to pay for management of the outbreak, you're on the skids for what, 10? Is that right, according to your submission?
Yeah.
So you're the most significant contributor in that sense.
It's just under 9, actually, Senator, and I've got it confirmed today from PHA. So you could just amend that to 9, 8.7 if you want to be exact. So we're the major contributor of all the industry. We're 100% reliant on the highest value. So I've got stakeholders, senators saying, hang on a minute, you want us to pay $8.7 million to contribute to this, to a national response that wasn't a national response, and we're down the toilet $300 million. How does that work?
Yeah, I can understand. I think from the reaction around the table, I think we all understand that how incongruous that they might see that being. Yeah. So in terms of where to manage this and who makes the appropriate contribution to potential incursion, your views around, as has been discussed earlier, a levy on containers, for example, coming into the country, making a significant contribution to the biosecurity effort, but also supporting this process?
Absolutely. According to a report in 2017, there was more than 1/3 of all pests and diseases have coming on a container. So we see that as, I think it was within the first couple of weeks, I was on the ABC calling for some sort of equity around the cost of this, and the freight industry seemed pretty supportive at the time.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jeff.
I think given the time, I'm happy to go over 8, but I think Senator Whish-Wilson might have to leave. So, Senator Whish-Wilson.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I just had a specific question on, you mentioned the National Response Plan, the Emergency Plan Pest Response Deed, the double PRD, is undermined by the current arrangements, in particular that it's voluntary, participation's voluntary. And there's some free riding going on. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more in terms of any specific concerns?
Like the previous speakers, I don't want to go isolating someone, but there is an industry that is fairly heavily reliant on pollination. That's not a signatory, but I believe that they've seen the ill of their ways and are working with PHA to rectify that.
So could you tell us who the industry is?
Prefer not to. It's not for me to be slagging off some other industry, but certainly PHA are aware of it. The upside of that is that if there is any sort of compensation, if you're not as available due to the impact of the incursion, that you're not eligible if you're not a signatory.
Right. Okay.
So there's a risk to them not being involved as well as them not, but them in this circumstance being a free rider.
Yep.
Okay. Well, perhaps we can talk to you privately then.
Yep.
Yeah, understand. Thank you. No, I think everything else is pretty clear to me. Well, perhaps just one other question. We've heard about from the previous witness about simulations, and obviously Varroa mite's been an issue that has a potential threat for some time that's been taken very seriously. Did you expect or did you anticipate you would get the kind of restrictions you've seen and the issues that have arisen once we've had a real outbreak? Was there plans in place that had been simulations in place, for example, where you'd expected this to be different?
I think that there has to have been a breakdown in the surveillance, given the fact that it's now accepted that Varroa potentially has been in that Newcastle area for at least 12 months, given the amount of mites they've found. Any amount of simulation is not going to be able to counter that sort of prevalence within that area. But certainly, from our point of view, we signed the deed in good faith that everyone would cooperate. But what we've experienced is that once it got down to the tin tacks, the borders were shut, and we were left high and dry.
So, do you think the fact that it was in Newcastle for some time, we've certainly heard evidence potentially from December the previous year. Do you think that's what led to a lack of confidence in, for example, traceability and records being kept properly, that kind of thing, and it was too high a risk to risk a super spreader event by sending bees to, Shepparton and in Victoria from interstate?
Without a doubt, the lack of an actual concrete hive movement register, national register, provided enough doubt in the minds of biosecurity officials in other states to say that we're not sure of how far this has gone.
Thank you, Senator Wilson. Senator White?
So would it be fair to say that you'd characterise the response from the relevant biosecurity authorities as inadequate?
Well, they didn't follow the national response. The national response came up with a plan which balanced the absolute need to contain the mite, but also the absolute economic impact that was going to occur if that wasn't followed.
So you don't. It isn't a national response. I mean, your view about the national response is that some states are severely disadvantaged, or they have disadvantaged your industry. Really, that's what you're talking about, isn't it?
Our industry and their communities. The economic impact will be way beyond our industry.
I note your submission calls for a range of additional surveillance and inspection activities to manage potential incursions. There are obviously costs in that. Do you have a view about how those types of activities could be funded?
Well, certainly the biosecurity levy would be a start in the right direction, I believe, and certainly the ability to have a far more transparent funding process of national responses would certainly engender a little bit more confidence around further processes down the track, just as has been mentioned previously.
Yeah, okay. Can I just ask you, were there any measures or actions that your organisation had been calling for prior to the detection on the 22nd of June to better address the risk of Varroa to the almond industry?
No, so as mentioned previously, there had been previous responses to Varroa, which we contributed to, which seemed to work, which did work, which eradicated the problem. This one, as I said before, the timing couldn't be worse, and the fact that it had actually been entrenched for at least 6 to 12 months meant that it was just a different response on a completely different scale than what we'd had before.
Okay. And just back to the biosecurity response against... apart from the biosecurity levy model, is there anything else that you have thought about? And should all industry players, including domestic farmers and producers, have to make a contribution?
I think it goes beyond the ag industry. I think we're paying through the nose for everything. So I think that given the fact that we're feeding the nation, I think there needs to be a far more equitable spread of the share of the cost of these sort of things.
So you think consumers should pay?
Well, no, I'm talking about, say for instance, I saw something recently where the amount of containers coming into the Port of Melbourne, for instance, is up some ridiculous amount in more recent years. There's no way now you can be actually providing the correct surveillance if you're maintaining levels or reducing levels and you've got more containers coming in. You've got the opportunity, one, to have more incursions, but you've also got an opportunity to increase your levy base. Your funding, if you can actually cover those, because a lot of the containers coming in haven't got food in them. They're not even, and it's, as the gentleman said before me, they could be in 5 or 6 different ports. And in more recent times, in the last 18 months, international freight has been sitting in places a lot longer than it normally does. It could be sitting in Singapore or out there for a long time, longer than it's probably more vulnerable than it's ever been.
Yeah, and so do you think that, just on that point, that is correct, isn't it? There's been backlogs of containers in a range of ports, and so the biosecurity measures have been pretty much under strain because they've been sitting around longer than they should have been, or what is regarded as not safe, but within the limits of what could happen to the containers. Do you think that has been a risk?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the speculations around Varroa. Got to Newcastle was some of these ships that couldn't get into port were sitting outside the port waiting for their turn.
Yeah.
Because of the lockdowns and the like.
Yeah. Thanks. That's nice.
Are there any other further questions? I've just got one more, Mr. Jackson. And I declare an interest. I'm quite a keen snacker on almonds, but is this reduced production this year likely to increase the price of almonds? And if so, how much?
I mean, I'll be in Canberra next week, Senator. I'll bring you a free bag.
I can't tell you, that would be a conflict of interest, Mr Jackson, so...
I'll bring one for everyone then.
All right. Well, hopefully we won't see that impact.
Unfortunately, at the moment, Senator, the price, and this is one of the real challenges we've got, is the global price, where a commodity of the global price of almonds is low and everything else is high. So this is
Right.
the major impact for our industry is when Varroa hit California, which produces 80% of the world's almonds, doubled the price of beehives. So they make 40 million this year. If Varroa hits and keeps going out, we could be up for $80 million worth of pollination next year, just on the, trying to get hives. That's not bad for 4 weeks' work.
Well, I hope that is avoided very much. And look, I really thank you, Mr Jackson, for your direct evidence this evening. It's very helpful. Sorry we were a little bit delayed, but thank you for bearing with us there as well. And with that, at this late hour, before I get to that, I do need to remind you that if there has been any questions on us, I don't think there was, but if there has been, we're asking for those back by the Thursday, the 22nd of September, and with that, I thank you. And it also concludes today's hearing. Thank you to all the witnesses who appeared, and especially to Hansard and Broadcasting for working late tonight, and the committee stands adjourned.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you.